This is Exploring the Shema, Discussions on the Issues of Trinity. And this study is available on my website as well. Again, go to tatesetorah.com, and from the home page or any pages, right at the very top of the cluster of links, click on the link that says Discussions on the Issues of Trinity right there. And this paper is a bit longer. It's intended to be 3 parts, 1, 2, and 3, pun intended there, Trinity study. And we're in paper 2. All of the videos that are attached to this study are right at the very beginning, so all of the media is there. Scroll down past all of the YouTube thumbnails, scroll down past all of the podcasts and the audios, and you can jump into the written study. There's also a PDF version if you'd like to print it and keep all the formatting. It's right available there. And so we're in paper 2 of this particular study, where we're talking specifically about Yahweh and Yeshua. We're looking at the challenges that face us as Christians and as Messianics of how can we say that Jesus is God, but at the same time Jesus is fully human, right? The whole hypostatic union discussion all over again. What about all of the Unitarians out there? What about all the Oneness Pentecostals, right? What about all of the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons? What about all of the Ecclesia, Christadelphi and Ecclesia, I can't remember their name. The groups out there that don't hold to the idea that Jesus is very God veiled in flesh. What do we do with that theology? And so most of this is very apologetic in nature. So what we've been looking at are passages out of the New Testament, and specifically we're still focused on John. We're going to conclude this tonight, by the way. John 1:1 is one of the favorite passages of Trinitarians such as myself, who hold to the belief that Jesus is very God veiled in flesh. Let me just state it right up front in case you misunderstand my position. I am a Messianic Jew. I hold to a belief that there's only one God, but I also hold to a belief that Jesus, Yeshua, is 100% human, but at the same time, he is 100% divine. He is very God veiled in flesh. I don't completely understand how that's possible, but I believe it because I believe that the Bible teaches it. And so I'm not afraid of admitting the fact that I worship Jesus as very God. Now, this doesn't make him God the Father. The Son is not the Father. The Holy Spirit is not the Son. So we've all seen the little Trinity badge. I probably got one on my screen right now in my post-production that you're looking at. Jesus is God, the Son, the Holy Spirit is God, and things like that, and the Father is God. But Jesus is not, the Son is not the Father, and the Holy Spirit is not the Son, and so God is one what and three who's, like Dr. James White is fond of saying. He's one God, but he's three persons. So I believe in the classic Nicene Creed or Apostolic Creed or whatever creed that you're used to reciting in your church tradition. So John 1:1 tells us that at the beginning the Word was with God, and this Word, which was eternal with God, was also very God himself. We looked at all of these possibilities of him being a God, like the Jehovah's Witnesses talk about. Was he a God? Was he a lesser God? Was he a mini God, kind of like a mini-me, right? A demigod? And we've come to the conclusion that that's not the best way to view these passages. Within the context of John explaining that Jesus is the Word made flesh, the Word who was with God and was God, the Word which incarnated, John lets us know in verse 14 that this Word became flesh, dwelt among us, and we've seen his glory as the only Son from the Father. And this verse 14 is a verse that's translated in a few different ways, and the ESV that I got pulled up talks about that Jesus is the only Son from the Father, and yet and it uses this Greek phrase monogenoůs. And what we discovered is that this phrase has been translated a few different ways, either translated as the one and only unique person, the unique one, or the one and only begotten. Based on previous understandings of this phrase begotten, monogenoůs from the Greek word monogenes, Jehovah's Witnesses and other Oneness Pentecostal and other Unitarian type groups come to the conclusion that Jesus is the one who was created by God. He's the one and only one that was created by God. Thus, Jehovah's Witnesses say the Word became flesh and resided among us, and we had a view of his glory as a glory such as belongs to an only begotten Son. And from their perspective, begotten refers to the time when God created Jesus. Let me see if I can find what they say in their commentary here. If I can find it, if I can't, that's fine. But from their perspective, Jesus was not he's not eternally God. He's not eternally God. He is the one who was, here we go. Let's see if I can highlight that one right there. The word's preeminent position as the firstborn Son of God, through whom God created all other things, as a basis for describing him as a godlike one, divine or divine being. He is the first one that God created, right? He is the first of God's creation. He is the first creature that God created. In fact, they say that here. This title was applied to Jesus during his human existence, the Word, as a spirit creature. So they don't believe, Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe that Jesus is eternal. But I disagree with the Jehovah's Witnesses. I disagree with Oneness Pentecostals. I disagree with the Christadelphos. I disagree with the Christadelphian, I think, or whatever they're called, the Iglesias. I'll remember their name a little later. And the other Unitarian positions that teach that Jesus is a lesser being than God. He's godlike, is what they say, and he possesses godlike qualities, and he can even be worshipped as God because of his exaltation by God the Father, but he's not very God according to that position. I disagree with that position. So let's turn in the last 10 minutes to Tim Haig's commentary on this passage, on John 1:14, and we'll pick up his commentary that I've got pulled up for you on the screen, and we'll finish this tonight. Again, I apologize that this is so technical for many of you, but there are those of us who need the technicalities, right? Not all of us want to just read the passage and go, okay, that's what my pastor says is true, so I guess that's what it must mean. If that works for you, I'm fine. Not trying to mock that. If that's the way you arrive at your truth, I'm fine with that. But that's not the way some of us work, and I'm one of those kind that just needs a little more technicality. So this is for those of you out there who think the way that I think. You need to get just a little technical sometimes. Tim Haig talks about how that this phrase about Jesus being begotten, how it's rendered in different passages, right? This monogenes, from that Greek word monogenoūs. The Greek original word is monogenes, and this gives rise to the phrase monogenoūs. In this verse, it was from this verse and others that speak of Yeshua as begotten that the doctrine of eternal generation of the Son was formulated during the Christological debates of the early Christian centuries. He goes on to say that in this regard, Psalm 2:7 formed the additional basis for the doctrine. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten thee. And so, in short, there were those who sought to interpret these texts as indicating a point in time at which Yeshua came into being, denying his eternal pre-existence, right? If John says that Jesus is the only begotten, just like we read in John 3:16, right, out of the KJV, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, this phrase monogenoūs, or monogenes, the original Greek, if Jesus is begotten, and the way that humans beget one another is to bring them into existence through the birthing process, right? Male and female get together, and out comes a baby. That's begettal. If that's true, then perhaps Jesus was not eternally existing with the Father, is what some fringe groups and some heretical groups and some different ways of understanding this passage. Perhaps maybe Jesus was brought into existence and God, quote-unquote, birthed him, that is, say, created him, and that's why he's the begotten Son. That's why we're having this discussion. That's why it's relevant for us. Just FYI, if we go over to Psalm 2 and look at it, we can see I've got Hebrew pulled up here and I've got Greek pulled up here. And in the Hebrew, there's a phrase right here, yeliditaka, where the psalmist says, I have begotten you. Literally, I've just the standard phrase for having children, right? Which is what in the English it says, I fathered you, kind of a KJV rendering. But when we can see from the Septuagint that there's a Greek word that's used here, right down there, gegonecha, and this phrase is rooted in the same word as monogenes. It's got the same genes part to it, which means begotten, or how you bring children into the world. So it is true that the psalmist could have been using that phraseology that was common in their day to beget children. But let's let Tim Haig explain what I think is a very strong case that can be made as to how a better way to understand this. And then that'll close out our commentary for tonight, and we'll close in prayer. Okay, I think I'm going just a little bit over in time. So, speaking of begotten, that we read about in Psalm 2, that we read about in John 1:14 and John 1:16 later on, and speaking of the phrase that shows up in John 3:16, this begotten. Does it mean, the question that was before us tonight, that we're going to answer hopefully, is does begotten mean that Jesus was created by God, that he was brought into existence by God, or does it refer to something else that was already present in the mind of the Hebrews, present in the mind of John as he worked through the Septuagint Greek, things like that? Let's listen to Tim Hegg. I think he's got an angle that's worth our listening to. Tim Hegg says, speaking about whether or not this is referring to Jesus being eternal or not, we call this a study in ontology, right? How do we understand the nature of God? That's ontological nature. Tim Hegg talks about how that such ontological wrangling was not what the biblical authors had in mind. That's kind of a shocker right out of the gate, is that perhaps that's not even what John's referring to. It may not be what God is talking about the psalmist in Psalm 2. He's not bringing in a debate as to whether Jesus was eternal or not when he says, today I have begotten thee. He's not talking about, let me explain to you, the psalmist. He's not trying to explain, hey, this is how Jesus' existence came to be. It's not a discussion about ontology. Rather, and Tim Hegg talks about, surely the desire of the church fathers to confess both the eternal and incarnational nature of Messiah is to be applauded, but the emphasis in the word monogenes is not so much ontological as it is relational, for it denotes a unique status and position which Yeshua has with the Father. Even as a son shares the same nature with his father, but has an identity distinct from him, so the use of monogenes denotes oneness with the Father, while at the same time maintaining their distinct identities. So Jesus is one with the Father, but yet he is his own person. Moreover, the use of begotten in Psalm 2:7 has clear covenant significance. We don't have to make it an ontological discussion. It has covenant significance, once again emphasizing relationship rather than ontological categories. So when we look at Psalm 2, where God says, through the mouth of the psalmist, you are my son, today I've begotten thee, a psalm that John in 1:14 would have been familiar with when he uses the same Greek word, same Greek phrase, monogenoũs, or monogenes, is the root word. Then both the writer to the book of Psalms as well as John, as well as the writer to the Hebrews, as we saw 2 weeks ago, they don't have to be focusing on this ontological aspect of this phrase monogenes. Rather, the Hebraic aspect can simply entirely focus on the relational aspect of father to son and why this bears covenant significance for the person who is the recipient of being begotten, like in the book of Psalms, like the Davidic king. So Hegg continues, thus, while the doctrine of the eternal generation of the Son was constructed in the first centuries to describe something that is true, so don't get me wrong, i.e. the eternal preexistence of Yeshua, I do believe that's a true statement. And I do believe that the first century fathers, the patristic writings, and the ensuing debates that took place between the 2nd and 5th centuries over the nature of Christ, I believe those were necessary and very helpful. And the creeds that we formulated finally later on in the later 4th and early 5th centuries, right, the Nicene Creed and things like that, I believe that those were necessary and they are good tools, and we can use that information. But at the same time, Tim Hegg's trying to let us know, and he continues, it essentially, focusing only on the nature of Christ, it essentially misconstrues the use of monogenes in John's gospel. What John's word tells us is that Yeshua is the only unique Son of God who became flesh, truly human, in order to dwell with us with the purpose that we should come to understand and appreciate the very glory of God. You understand what Tim Hegg's trying to focus on? It's not that Jesus is not God. Yes, John understands that. He talked about that earlier in verse 1. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Not a God, not a demigod, not a lesser God that comes alongside of the greater God or something to that effect, but very God himself, possessing the same quality and deity and nature and essential function. We would say in the Greek, the homoousios, or the homoousion, the very same nature as God. The Son possesses that very same nature. He's one in this, or now we say consubstantial is what we say in our creeds. But the point that John's trying to make in verse 14 when he describes Yeshua as being the only begotten is not that he is this eternally existent being like God was. The point that John's trying to stress now by using this phrase monogenoũs, which is rooted in the Greek word monogenes, is that Jesus is the only unique Son of God. He is truly human. He dwelt with us, as Tim Hegg says, with the purpose that we should come to understand and appreciate the very glory of God. And Tim Hegg concludes, and we'll use this to conclude our study tonight, this last paragraph right here is what I'm going to read, right there. John goes on in his prologue to note the witness of Yochanan the Immerser, that's John the Baptist, to Yeshua's unique status. That is, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. That's verse 15. So John does express his ontological nature there. Once again, the preexistence of Yeshua is affirmed, for Yochanan was born months before Yeshua, yet he confesses that Yeshua, quote, existed before me, end quote. So we know that John is speaking of a pre-existent Messiah. Literally, before me he was, is what we would say in the Greek, hati protos mu ein. Once again, the verb to be, right, that John is highlighting, which we're fond of highlighting when we're looking at these types of ontological passages. This be verb, right, is contrasted with the verb to become, the ginomai, that we read about earlier. Moreover, in the same way, the Moses testimony is sure. The way Moses' testimony is sure and to be received, so Yochanan's witness of the Messiah is true. John's going to go on to say, for the Torah was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Yeshua the Messiah, in verse 17. If the Torah, Tim Hay concludes, if the Torah is received as a very revelation of God to Israel, which it was in Paul's day, right, in John's day, then the Messiah who eternally existed to the Father should all the more be received. It's using kind of a light from heavy argument, kal v'chomer. So that's going to be the conclusion of looking at John 1:14 that we've been working through in this particular part of our commentary. Let me see. Let's see. In our Exploring the Shema, we had a little table. Let me see if I can find it. It's basically down near the very end here, right here. And we basically worked through John 1:1 and John 1:14. So next week, we'll be poised to look at Colossians 2:9 real quick, about how the Son is called God, or uses terminology that links him to God. So we're done with John for now. If you have further questions about the John studies, go to my website, Exploring the Shema. Go to my website at taketorah.com and click on the Explore the discussions on the issues of Trinity link. That'll take you to the Exploring the Shema page. And as you begin to scroll down, look at all the videos that have to do with John, right? Easily the last probably 20 or 30 videos where we worked down through the idea of John, starting way over here, part 42.3, or I say maybe part 42.1, and working your way all the way to part 48. So there's a lot of parts. Go back and watch those little videos. They're short. They're 3 to 5 minutes long, so you can easily take them in. You can binge watch them if you want. But we'll continue through our study of the Shema and have these difficult discussions on how can Jesus be fully God and fully human, something that we affirm, okay? Amen? Amen. Let's close in prayer.